BioBalance Healthcast, episode 130, Senior Citizens and Sex.
BioBalance Healthcast features conversations about positive aging. Your hosts are Dr. Kathy Maupin, Medical Director of BioBalance Health and a leading expert in treating symptoms of aging, and Brett Newcomb, a licensed professional counselor.
So this week we're going to talk about something that we haven't talked about in a long time, but it's one of our favorite topics, sex. And it came up because of an article in Endocrine News.
Endocrinologists are the hormone doctors.
In September of 2012. And we read it, we talked about it, we were surprised by the information, and a lot of which we want to share with you today. But what came out of our preliminary conversations was a lot of anecdotal stories about people that we know and situations that they have been in or have encountered. Remember when you were a teenager and you were first starting to become aware of things sexual, and you knew you'd learned the process by which babies are developed and arrive, and you look at your parents and you think, my parents don't do that. There's no way my parents do that.
I don't want to think about that.
You know, you think, oh, that's gross. You know, you look at your mom and your dad, it's like, oh, that's gross. They don't do that stuff. Well, age yourself 30 years, be 47, be 50 years old, and think about your 70 or 80-year-old parents still having sex, or think about your 70 or 80-year-old single parent being sexual. And that's what this article was talking about.
So if you can't take that, if that grosses you
you
out,
may want to leave now.
You may want to leave because we don't want to gross anyone out. But I can see how that might be.
But I would encourage you not to, because there's some really shocking information. You know, what happens is that both reality in our society changes faster than our cultural perceptions change. And what we are learning is that people who are living longer and staying healthy longer are having sex longer. And so there's some interesting data. A survey was done in England, and they report that 80% of people between 50 and 90 respond that they're having regular sexual encounters.
I think it's because they're retired and they don't have anything else to do, but they have to have a sex drive first.
They have to have a sex drive.
So now I'm not sure how that works.
In the United States, the numbers break down. 73% of those people between 57 and 64.
Regular may mean once a month too, you know. It may not mean.
You know, for some of us, regular sex is just thinking about it once in a while.
That's right, and and it's a survey, so.
53% from age 65 to 74, and 26% from 76 to 85.
That's amazing.
I mean, it is amazing.
And that's good for them. I mean, in many ways, it's good for you. I mean, in the neurotransmitter
it's good
world,
in terms of cuddling and oxytocin and being physical and being touched. And especially, I mean, part of the social issue, perceptually, you don't think about your grandmother having a boyfriend. You don't think about your grandmother.
Or you don't want to think about it.
Shacking up somewhere or getting laid. You know, none of those concepts relate to grandma. And especially you don't want to think about grandpa going to the drugstore and buying condoms.
That's true.
You know, here's grandpa who's a widower who's beginning to date on,
because he'll be saying he's buying them for his grandson.
Older people are us, .com, and so he's looking for women to go out with, and part of that whole process is touching and cuddling and holding and the connectivity and joy that brings. But for some of these people, it also brings arousal. And what we have found is that in the last decade, the last 10 years, STDs among seniors have increased by 50%. 50% increase in STDs, particularly syphilis and chlamydia.
And honestly, that generation, the people who are there now, didn't think of condoms as anything except pregnancy.
Procreation, right.
Pregnancy prevention. They didn't think about it in terms of preventing diseases. So now they're going, I can't get anybody pregnant, so.
Right, so I don't have to worry about it.
So now
I don't need to use it.
They're having multiple partners, especially in living circumstances where you're living right next door to somebody, and if you're not living in your own home, if you're widowed and you're living in a retirement village, this stuff happens, and that's the downside. No doctor's going to really go, oh yeah, I'm going to check you for syphilis or chlamydia or gonorrhea. Now, gonorrhea has symptoms usually, and all of them do, but they may misinterpret the symptoms as old age or dry vagina or something.
That's what the article said in Endocrine News. It said that one of the issues, especially in nursing homes, has to do with confusion between the reporting symptoms for just getting old.
Right,
and
bladder infections
for STDs.
look a lot like an STD. So if your doctor doesn't really think of an STD, they don't check you for that. They just treat you for the bladder infection, which may or may not kill the STD.
Well, again, you got a young doctor, you got a 35-year-old doctor who's doing their rotation at the nursing home.
Having sex.
He's not thinking that this place is, a hotbed of sexual activity.
After I worked at the VA, I realized when I was a medical student from all of those guys that everybody was interested in that.
Oh, yeah.
And that was on the top of their minds. That's when I became a gynecologist.
Yeah.
So, sometimes it changes your life. But at that time, that was one of those things that did shock me, but I had an awareness of it, and I knew that just because they were 70 or 80, that they were still interested in having sex, and they were still, it was a man's hospital. So they were all like, they wanted to go out, they wanted to escape,
right.
And then come back and then get care, but they weren't necessarily really happy about being with all guys. They wanted the opposite sex.
Well, and I remember when I taught high school years ago, some of the girls would get jobs, part-time jobs at nursing homes. And they would invariably have to be counseled by the staff at the nursing home. A lot of these old men are lecherous old men. And you're giving them a shower, or you're helping them bathe, or you're trying to move them around.
They lose their inhibitions. Many of them have thinking process problems, or they have dementia or Parkinson's.
But
or
their
something.
physiology still is aroused.
Their physiology is aroused, but they may or may not have lost their ability to say, ooh, this is the wrong social situation for me to be aroused in, so I'm going to calm down.
Right.
They may have lost that ability. So it's one of those things that you do have to be counseled if you're taking care of anybody.
Right, because they will say things. Well, it's the same thing that recovery nurses are taught. When you come out of anesthesia, the first part that surfaces is your primitive brain, and you say horrific things that you would be distraught that anyone would ever hear you, that you'd never say. But it comes
I usually say something like, am I late for something? Because that's my usual first thought.
I've had several recovery nurses say that men in particular, when they come out of anesthesia, are really obscene in the things that they say. And because they don't have those filters. Yeah. So you don't know. Okay.
No, but women are usually, a little more, they're a little more practical about coming out of anesthesia. They usually say stuff like, did I forget to go get this? Or, they're not, or they just yell.
Still taken care of.
Yeah, they're taking care of everybody.
So talking about the elderly, though, and having sex and having arousal and all of that, I mean, this article references that even those patients suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's in the earlier stages of that disorder still have pretty active sexual desires and seek out some kind of connection and relief. And there are arguments in our society that are being had and conversations that need to be had about what's the proper way to respond to this. Do you put rules in place in a nursing home so that people can't touch, can't hold each other, can't have sex? Do you provide medicines for them so that you inhibit their sex desire? Do you artificially obstruct them in some way? Or should they be free to have that pleasure if that pleasure is something they seek?
Unless it's forced on someone else. And see, that's, you have to, there's so many things to think about.
Right.
Because if you've lost your inhibitions, you may think somebody says yes and they said no.
Right.
And that may be a problem. So all of those things have to be considered. It's not always just nursing homes. I mean, there's levels of care.
Right.
And if you're in independent living, no doctor's going to come in and say, hey, I need to check you for STDs. You may be living alone in independent living, and you may be totally in control of everything, but you may be having a lot of sex with a lot of willing partners.
Yeah.
Then when you get to assisted living, you may lose more inhibitions, but then it would be easier to test those people because they're more willing to let you test them because they don't feel as well. And when you get to nursing homes, it would be easier if you said, if everybody was tested for STDs and treated. That would make it easier. That doesn't mean that no one will get an STD because people come in from outside. In other words, you may have a visitor who's not part of that nursing home bring something in.
Well, and we're going to the extreme end of it, the nursing home end of it, because that's kind of fascinating and somewhat surprising that people that age would still be that overtly sexual. But just step back a decade or a decade and a half from where most people go into nursing homes. The divorce rate among those 60 and over in the United States is beginning to skyrocket. You have all these empty nesters who have retired, who don't have children at home to take care of, who look at each other and say, I don't really know who you are, I don't like you anymore, I want to be on my own.
Some have lost their libido and they
And
haven't come to
some-
see me and I haven't been able to give it back to them, so.
And others still have it, or they have come to see you, and even though they're now single and they have it. And so they approach things sexual from the perspective of being middle-aged and having been married and having free access to sex and not having to think about any of those consequences, especially of the age where you're not thinking about getting somebody pregnant.
Right.
Or getting yourself pregnant. And so if that's not an issue, why would you ever use a condom? Well, let me give you some statistics. Only 12% of single dating men and 32% of single dating women over the age of 45 say they use condoms consistently.
But we were in the generation of the pill. See, I always look at
For
that
that reason, I understand.
I look at things generational. That when I was in the 70s, no one used condoms because everybody was on the pill.
Right.
And that was one of the
Because
problems.
they all
equate
condoms with procreation and not with STD.
Right. And so there were a lot of STDs then, and then a lot of infertility later because of that.
Right.
I mean, not all infertility is that, but sometimes it is. So a lot of that is also generational. They grew up, now they're in their 60s.
And
70s.
they still have the mindset.
And they still have the mindset of,
yeah.
if you don't get pregnant, then you don't have to use condoms. Now, I think the generation following that, our children's age will use condoms because they grew up with AIDS.
Well, and that's the other thing about the other piece of that statistic about people over 45 who are single and having sex, not using condoms. 17% of all new HIV diagnoses in the United States and 23% of all new AIDS diagnoses in 2009 were in those age 50 and older.
That's really scary.
It's frightening. And so grandma, there are a lot of 50-year-old grandmas out there. Grandma could be at risk in ways she couldn't even remotely imagine.
Because she would never consider. Plus, immune systems, as we've talked about, unless you support them by replacing hormones and replacing nutrients and replacing vitamins and good diet, your immune system does decrease with age. If you do all those things, it may not. But if you're in that stage where it's decreasing, then you're much more at risk for any virus, and AIDS is a virus, or HIV is a virus.
So things too, though, in the elderly or aging female population, as you age, you get what's called vaginal atrophy.
If you don't use estrogen and you don't use testosterone, the vagina gets very small and very, very
Thin
thinned
membrane.
out. It doesn't stretch anymore. So if you haven't had sex and then you have sex, it tears the vagina. It doesn't feel good. It feels terrible. Everybody who's described this to me says it's like sandpaper, and then it's like
And that creates little
being
open
ripped, and you have
microabrasions,
little tiny little cuts.
which are receptor sites for any virus that's
It
coming
lets
back.
everything in.
Yeah,
And it's-
directly into your
and so
system.
you're at more risk for getting that than normal. The normal vagina with estrogen and testosterone is thickened.
somewhat protective.
And is somewhat protective, which is why women don't usually get AIDS as much.
Right.
They're not as at risk unless they have herpes sores that lets
that
it
are
in.
open,
Right.
that are active.
If they have herpes sores, then they're more at risk. But the
Because it has to
vagina
have
is
an entry point.
Yeah, it has to
Yeah.
get into the bloodstream. So if the vagina is a good is well estrogenized, then honestly, it's a good protector. But after menopause, if you don't replace estrogen and you are single and you have multiple partners, then you should be using condoms, and you should be getting some estrogen to thicken the lining of the vagina as well. Mm-hmm. Condoms wouldn't feel good if you had atrophy either. Kind of makes me want to double cross my legs. Sounds awful.
Well, another indicator for women who are out there that may be a cautionary tale is that single men, and we're talking about the population over 50, divorced, widowed, whatever, who are trying to be sexual, may also be of an age where they are taking ED drugs. Mm-hmm. And those men in that category who are taking ED drugs are much more likely to get STDs, perhaps because they're using it more and distributing it more and have
because
greater
they can actually use
mathematical occurrences. Mm-hmm. But if you're being approached by one of these men and you are considering having sex with them and they are taking ED drugs, and there are any number of ways that you can tell. One is to ask them, but there are other ways that you can tell.
Rifle through their...
You need to require them to use a condom.
Yeah.
You know, it just really... And so what the summative point
you
of the
bring
article...
them. I mean, nobody really thinks about that. You bring the condom.
Yes.
You know, women can... In this new age, the young women know that they can bring the condoms.
Yeah.
But...
Can you
people
imagine?
older than
I
me
am of an age. I don't
that.
have a grandfather left. My grandfathers are
I don't have a parent left.
all dead. My parents, yes, are dead. But I have an adolescent. I have a 17-year-old son, and I can just reading this, I was imagining myself having to talk to my 17-year-old son and my 72-year-old father about using condoms. Just sit them down together and have this conversation.
Yeah, and but you would present it differently.
You would.
And I'm not sure, I'm hoping that this could be presented nicely to parents who are no longer married because of death or divorce.
Right.
So or you can just say, hey, you need to watch this thing.
Well,
you need to listen to this podcast. It might help you. They might even be offended at that. But it's hard to take advice from your children. But you should.
It's easy to make jokes because culturally we're uncomfortable. And we use humor as a way to protect us from our discomfort. But it is truly a thing about which we should think, in part because we have people that we love who are now in these positions, but in part because if most of us live long enough, we're going to be in those positions.
Right.
And how does one make those decisions personally, familially, because sometimes the extrapolated family is involved in making those decisions. I mean, a nursing home romances. You know, grandma and grandpa are both, grandma's in the nursing home, she meets this nice older guy, they want to get married and be together and stay in the same room for the time that they have left. What's wrong with that? Well, there may be things that are wrong with that from the perception of the extended families.
Yeah, but...
Not the least of which is, how do you regulate the inheritances? You know, and if grandma's going to die and leave me $3 million, I don't want her to marry some bozo and have his kids inherit her $3 million. And so I want to get involved in that discussion.
Right.
And you see a lot of that.
And that's your area of counseling people about how they should approach that. But I think that thought flashed in front of my mind for about 1 second when my dad was in nursing care. I think it did. I mean, not that he had a ton of money, but
Kathy, I've seen so many families where those are bitterly debated issues.
I know.
I mean, even from the perspective of, morally, is it right? What does our religion teach? And mom's always been a virtuous woman, and now she's in this nursing home, this man's coming on to her, and they're not married. So then what? And people feel deeply about those issues.
No.
And we don't have ready, good, easy answers.
There is no easy answer to that. And that's not something that we can, unless they're not competent, we really can't moralize for them. But there are ways to get married and still keep your inheritance for your kids.
I know, but that's also part of the fight that goes on when those questions come up. How do you protect everybody legally, and do the two primary participants, the man and the woman who are going to get married, are they on board with that? I mean, one of the things, again, in counseling people who are dealing with aging parents is, how do you counsel your parents about end-of-life decision making? Do you have medical directives? Is it time to give up your car keys and quit driving? What do you want done with your assets? Do you have specific desires for things to go to specific people? And a lot of people who are aging really are defended against those conversations.
Well, that's because then they know that if they do that, then they can die. And if they don't do it, they think that'll keep them alive.
And they feel a loss of power. They feel a loss of connectivity and engagement in life. And it is a generational challenge to have those conversations for both halves of the generation.
Well, do you have that stuff written down? I don't.
I have it all written down.
I'm 58,
and I have it in a lockbox, and my son
I've only
knows
got one
where.
child,
Well, I have two, one who's
Yeah.
42 and one who's 17, and they both know where that stuff is. And I've sat down and explained to both of them exactly what the will is and what gets distributed. You know, there's 32 cents in the bank. You get 12, and you get 20. I think it's important, and I've talked to both of them about medically what I want done if I lose the capacity to announce my desire.
Is it written?
It is written down. Okay. My wife has it. I mean, we've gone through that recently with dying grandparents and trying to help them process through and do what they wanted done. And some of them had all that written down and some didn't. And it's just really, really difficult.
It has to be accessible too. I'm sure mine's all in the file, and I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know exactly where
that
in the
is.
file.
Yeah, you know. So what we're talking about, you know, is sex and money.
Yeah.
As you get old, and families having to deal with that. But there's a piece of it that we're not talking about that I really want to emphasize, because I believe so passionately that it matters, and that is the human connectivity of holding hands, of touching. I mean, when we talk about older people in nursing homes, we're not necessarily talking about vaginal penetration and rah-rah intercourse. So much of it is touching and stroking and holding and cuddling, and the opportunity to do that is...
And being left alone long enough to just have some privacy of your own.
I
think that's so important.
Hope that I always have that, and that people that I love always have that. And what some nursing homes do to try to provide for that is pet therapy. They regularly bring in cats and dogs for these old people to love on.
But
and
you know
even
what?
the
That
ones,
still wouldn't do it for me. I mean, you know, it's nice to have dogs, but
it wouldn't do it for you now because
but
you are cognitive and conscious and aware. But if you're senile, you suffer from dementia, and you're still human and physiologically alive,
it would still...
It does make a difference.
It was... No, I mean, I think it makes a difference, but I just think that it doesn't probably...
It wouldn't be enough.
...satisfy everybody.
Oh, no.
That's
Absolutely
not going to be
No.
enough for everyone.
No, but better a little than none at all.
You're right. And pet therapy, they brought dogs in to see my dad, and he loved it. And we brought our dogs in to see my dad.
So I guess at the end of the day, as you can tell from our conversation, it's just another conversation that needs to be had. It's another consciousness and another awareness. But there are very real life-threatening risks that exist out there as we age if we're sexually active, and that we need to follow the same rule that we followed in high school, which is use protection.
And you should give your parents give them the respect that they're human beings, and
the support.
If they're conscious and they don't need a guardian, if they can make their own decisions, that, as you know, love them when you have the conversation. Don't make it a fight. It's a loving conversation. It's not about trying to control them or make them do something.
No.
It's about, you care about them, you want them to be well, and you want them to live their life fully as long as they have life, but you want them to be safe as well.
Well, it's very similar to the conversation I have with my adolescent child. I love you. I'm not in any way saying I approve of this or want you to do this or think it's okay, but if you're going to do it, be safe.
Here's some condoms. No.
Here's some condoms.
Yeah.
And I recently had this conversation with him. You
should.
Are you willing to go into a drugstore yourself and buy these if you need them, or you need me to go with you and show you how it's done and help you, or even bring them to you? Because I will, as long as I can still say, I don't approve and I don't want you to do it. You're not old enough yet to be responsible for that. Of course, now if I'm talking to my 70-year-old grandmother, I can't tell her she's not old enough, but there may be a question of responsibility and safety. So it's an interesting conversation to have.
Email your questions or comments to podcast@biobalancehealth.com. You can find the BioBalance Healthcast on iTunes and on YouTube. For more information about bioidentical hormone pellet therapy and other reverse aging solutions, visit biobalancehealth.com or call 314-993-0963. You can find Dr. Maupin on Twitter at Dr. Kathy Maupin and on Facebook at facebook.com/biobalancehealth. Find Brett Newcomb at brettnewcomb.com.